Welcome back. All right. Welcome to our last session. Let me introduce Elaine and Sozi, who will moderate this session and panel. Elaine is an assistant professor at the Boston University School of Public Health, and she's the assistant director of research at Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. And her research is focused on the use of data and technology to address health inequity and improve health in communities globally. So please, Elaine.
Thank you, Gianluca. I'm very excited about this session. So today's speakers will discuss the threat that misinformation poses to public health and what can be done to mitigate health misinformation with a focus on COVID-19. I want to start off by thanking all the BU faculty organizers for supporting the development of this session, and this include Lee Go, Chris Su, Derry Wijaya, and Gianluca Stringini. I'd also like to welcome today's panelists, starting with Angela Wu, who is a professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. We'll also have John Bryden, who is executive director and senior research scientist at the Observatory on Social Media at Indiana University. And last but not least, we have Fernando Bemijo, who is a faculty associate at the Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. He's also a research director at Media Cloud and an associate professor at IE University in Madrid. So before we proceed, we have some housekeeping items. So I'd like to remind everyone that today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Hariri Institute's YouTube channel this week. We encourage the audience to participate and ask questions using the Q&A feature. All questions will be held until after the panel discussion, and the chat function will be turned off. So our first speaker today for this panel is Angela. Angela.
Hi. Thank you so much, Elaine. Should I start and share my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
So you guys can see my screen, right? Okay, great. So hi, everyone. It's really great to be part of this panel. My work is at the intersection of media and communication and science and technology studies. I look at the online user behavior at transnational scale. And part of my research also has to do with Chinese information technology, Chinese online cultures, and politics. And in these seemingly diverse areas, I'm particularly interested in the practices and cultures of computing and knowledge production. That is how we come to know something and what influences this process. So what I'll talk about today incorporates findings from in-depth investigations of platform usership, platform design, and business strategies to the concerns of large-scale analyses based on platform logs or trace data. So here's what I have. Platform trace data are increasingly used to study human behavior. And existing discussions tend to focus on data representativeness, data privacy, the precarious access to such data at the mercy of platforms, and the data's commercial origin. What I'll talk about today complements these discussions. I'll focus on the measurement conditions of platform trace data to highlight a series of methodological and ethical concerns. I'll then use China and Chinese platform trace data as a relatively extreme case to show what it looks like when these problems are exacerbated. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. My talk is built upon these publications from last year. Platform data are impressive due to their granularity and volume. Also that they seem to be passively measured behavioral data. In other words, they seem to be unobtrusive recordings of our activities when no one's watching. In recent proposals to develop computational social science, for example, much effort is concentrated on expanding data collaborations and data infrastructures with platform companies. I argue that platform data's apparent strengths for social scientific research are outweighed by limitations of the data's measurement conditions. And by that, I mean how platform trace data come about. All data results from measurement processes designed and executed to serve a given institutional context. For example, to research climate change and figure out human intervention on a planetary scale, we need internationally unitary standards to observe the weather. Another example is the rubric of US Best College metrics. What the metrics contain directly induces investment in American higher education in certain areas, but not others. Platform data are generated as platforms' records of their own behavioral experimentation. And this datafication is calibrated to answer questions of interest to these companies. Platforms constantly modify their digital architectures to observe user activities. And as they do so, they also change the measurement methodology. And this therefore creates data that is not necessarily fungible from one moment to the next moment. So how to evaluate such a measurement condition when the resulting data are repurposed in academic research? In this paper, Harsh, Taneja, and I illustrate the tensions by comparing platform datafication with third-party audience measurement. So to summarize briefly, whereas the longer tradition of third-party measurement firms such as Nielsen and Comscore measure people's browsing patterns to provide currency for a multi-sided advertising market, platforms measure internally for their own administrative purposes. Third-party measurement firms live off of selling measurement data. And we must know that their customers include content producers and advertisers, and these customers' interests are in conflict. So in order to sell their measurement data, third-party measurement firms must convince their customers that their methods are unbiased. And this convincing includes various mechanisms such as periodic auditing. And beyond this, third-party firms have no investment in how web users behave or in any particular measurement rationale. In sharp contrast, platform companies are invested in both. Platforms thrive through managing user behavior, and their profit hinges on user behavior that's manifested in their own measurement. A platform's datafication infrastructure is set up and deployed to improve design features, fuel advertising analytics, and please investors. This infrastructure serves what we call platform episteme, or the platform's way of knowing. Meanwhile, the platform datasets that external researchers lay their hands on contain little information about the platform's own methods for creating and managing data on user behavior. It also contains little information on how platforms deploy such data to influence user behavior. And this is unsurprising because such secrets enable platforms' business models. What external researchers identify and interpret as correlations within platform trace data thus amount to partial and contorted accounts of human contact. Such accounts essentially conceal platform interventions. For example, how platform rankings, recommendations, and display aesthetics shape user behavior. And I should mention that platform interventions also include commercial content moderation, whose rules keep proliferating and is widely documented nowadays. This means that as researchers draw conclusions from this data, they are also drawing on a historical set of conditions and decisions made by the tech platforms. In short, we cannot extrapolate human behavior from platform traces without accounting for platform governance. And when we treat platforms as transparent vehicles for users' inherent intentions, scholarship effectively obscures platform companies' prevailing power. But the problem is, as long as platforms remain opaque about their own methods for managing user behavior, academic research employing platform data are prone to replicating platforms' own episteme. And to resist this requires deliberate and innovative research design that foregrounds the role of platforms in the captured human phenomenon. And this, related to today's theme, includes the supply and circulation of misinformation. At its core, the methodological pitfall I just discussed is about a lack of contextual knowledge regarding platform datafication. And such contextual knowledge includes the shaping forces of platform architectures, but may also include other structural and infrastructural forces. This lack becomes particularly salient in the transnational repurposing of platform data. And China here is a striking case in point. China becomes a land of massive data sets for a number of reasons: the predominance of huge platforms, laxer market regulations, and the absence of public organizing about data privacy, and also an enormous digital world thanks to the government's long-term infrastructural investments. While Chinese big data have been moving across borders to feed the neural networks of startups and fuel Silicon Valley innovations, I want to talk about their destination within academic computing. Many have celebrated the explosion of Chinese platform data as an invaluable opportunity to study China, where other data sources have been limited due to political sensitivity. Now, going back to my previous points on platform trace data, yes, Chinese platform governance involves the commercial platform's ever-shifting architectures and modulations, but additionally, it also involves the platform's often hidden attempts to fulfill political directives from government agencies through content curation and removal. Repurposing Chinese platform data thus tends to replicate a platform episteme that embeds political control as well. And such analyses are likely to obscure algorithmic and institutional governance over user activity, including the censorship regime at work. What's more, when platform data serve as the only data source, their intrinsic features also limit knowledge production. As I have elaborated in a recent essay, platform trace data and data scraped from online venues are typically about the behavior of individual user accounts and the semantic content of spoiling textual fields online. Lacking direct measures for gender, income, ethnicity, and so forth, these data, despite their abundance, are unfriendly to the investigation of structural inequality. Further, in American universities, government grants and private philanthropy used to be a lifeline for developing the so-called indigenous knowledge of foreign territories. But since the end of the Cold War, these supports have been dwindling. As academic jobs becomes fast-paced and competitive, in the social sciences, graduate mentors discourage students to spend time in linguistic training and fieldwork. Adding to this is the embrace of STEM talent that comes with, especially with the expansion of computational social science. And this itself reflects changes in institutional resource allocation. There's a tendency to employ Chinese platform data to build up claims about abstracted human behavior. In this extreme form, research may actively occlude distinctly Chinese histories and configurations in attempts to justify these data as proxies for generic social constructs and social theories. Such constructs like social capital, public sphere, and agenda setting and diffusion patterns are usually developed from examining phenomena in Western contexts and presume particular institutional conditions that China actually lacks. As such, we see a specter of China, a China devoid of organizational and cultural complexity that's presented more and more in conferences and journals. How can we pursue and present accounts approximating truth if we're relying on data that's been obliquely manipulated and managed? To sum up, both platform data's intrinsic limitations and the incentives of West-centric academic knowledge production are prone to obscuring local conditions that shape people's lives and mindsets and what they say, what they do, including on social media. At the same time, as academic data infrastructures continue to expand in collaboration with platform companies and with transnational data brokers, various types of contextual knowledge are also being diluted and sidelined. And this is not the fault of any individual's decision, but the new academic ecology. I'd like to emphasize this. This is a new academic ecology shared by all of us. The pitfalls highlighted in the China case are broadly shared by repurposing platform trace data to study human behavior overall. Measurement choices, obscured platform experimentation, and political pressure dictating acceptable content are factors that shape non-Chinese platform data as well. How to do better? I have a few thoughts to hopefully start a collective discussion. First of all, academic repurposing of platform data must restore and confront their measurement conditions. What is the life trajectory of the data set? How was it created, processed, and acquired? And is it possible to make responsible use of such data if I can't answer these questions? And second, from socioeconomic class, gender, race, and citizenship, to the arrangement of national media systems and state governance, from corporate capital and platform technologies to partisan and electoral landscapes, these are all very powerful structural forces. And they remain particularly powerful by keeping their operations out of sight. Analyses, therefore, should aspire to reveal the circumstances and voices that these structures intend to obscure. But to do this, we must step outside of platform data. We must painstakingly weave together contextual knowledge so that our research designs speak to the lived cultural, social, and political realities of people whose data are taken for our analysis. And this is, it is inevitable that quantitative abstraction flattens lived experience. But by striving in this direction and working to rehydrate data with rich contingent context, we may wield quantification and quantitative research to challenge social inequality, powerful predatory organizations, and oppressive cultural norms. At the same time, when looking at the burgeoning studies using platform trace data, we must be mindful of their methodological pitfalls. We need to pause and consider their findings by asking ourselves whether they replicate platform episteme that glosses over platform interference, whether they conceal forces shaping platform governance, including political control, whether they sideline investigations of structural inequality in a society, and whether they leave out formative institutional and cultural context when interpreting numerical results. And on this last point, I really like to mention, given our symposium's theme, that when it comes to health-related misinformation, there's much to be learned from research on misinformation and politics. We may consider health-related information as science, and that's very distinct from political discussion where things are more charged, fluid, and shaped by people's political beliefs and ideologies. But science and technology studies and the history of science have told us that in public perceptions, health and illnesses always carry complex cultural connotations. And these cultural connotations directly connect to local politics and with other cultural norms. Just think about the history of the domestic HIV/AIDS epidemic and currently COVID-19. And this makes the role of cultural social analysts particularly important in the joint research endeavor. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. If you have any questions for Angela, please put it in the Q&A. Our next speaker now is John Bryden.
Sorry about that. I had to unmute myself before sharing my screen. Okay, can you see and hear me okay now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm John Bryden. I work at the Indiana University Observatory on social media. We do a lot of work quantitatively studying misinformation online on mainly Twitter, but also Facebook, and studying how that information has an impact on behavior in the real world. So that's the main topic we're addressing today with this talk. So just to give a bit of background, I'm sure we're all aware that COVID has been a massive deal in the United States. We're looking at 670,000 deaths as of September this year. So vaccinations are our main strategy to address this problem of COVID. And the ideal thing with a vaccine is to get a large proportion of your population vaccinated, because at that point, then you achieve what's called herd immunity, where there's enough people vaccinated, there's not a chance of the disease to spread in the population. And the estimates of many models were that before we started vaccination, that we were looking at a 60–70% vaccination rate. However, that was based on old figures, and we're now looking at this new Delta variant, which is spreading much more quickly. So on top of that, we're looking at high rates of people being hesitant to be vaccinated. And we've got a number of 55% fully vaccinated in the US as of September 2021. So we wanted to look at the vaccination patterns and why people are hesitant, or try to investigate that. So vaccine hesitancy has a wide range of reasons. People may be delaying because they're waiting to see what happens to other people. Other people just will not be vaccinated. So there are lots of factors involved, and the main factors tend to be if someone's conservative or African American. And it's important to start to build communication strategies to particular groups to build confidence in those groups. However, that's difficult when there is a large quantity of misinformation out there. And some results have already found that there's some links between online misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. So what we've done is we started to collect tweets, online tweets from Twitter, and we looked for ones that were associated with vaccines. And we've collected about 250 million of those by now, starting at the beginning of this year. And what we're able to do is identify misinformation in a tweet according to the source the tweet came of the information came from. So if a tweet has tweeted a particular website, and a famous one is childrenshealthdefense.org. We've got a whole list of these websites that they tend to tweet. We can pretty much guarantee that that tweet is often posting misinformation, that account. So we're looking at the number of tweets that are posting misinformation, and we're able to assign those to geographical areas according to the location of the account. And then we're able to do correlation statistics on the geographical regions. So we produced this tool called Covaxy. It's available online. And if you just Google Covaxy, you'll be able to see it. And that's presenting all of this information that we have on the different states. And we're also looking at the different websites that are producing misinformation and how often those are being tweeted. There's a lot to play on the website, so please have a go and checking that out. But for now, I'm going to focus on a bit more detail on the results that we found linking misinformation to vaccine uptake and vaccine hesitancy. So we're looking at large-scale associations between misinformation and hesitancy. So we're up to 250 million posts now, but when we did this initial study, we were at 55 million posts. We're using regression models and Granger causality analysis. A number of other covariates we investigated were GOP vote, percent below poverty, age of population in the region. I think we also looked at African American percentages as well. So in vague terms, the results are that we have a negative relationship between misinformation and vaccine uptake rates. So more misinformation, less vaccines, basically. And that's corroborated by this idea that the more misinformation we have, the more hesitant people are to have vaccines. The vaccination hesitancy rates were taken from a Facebook survey. So that was done with Facebook just putting questions up on people's walls and their opinions about vaccines. Okay, so I'll just, because we're not particularly endowed with time, just quickly skip through this. We're getting data from Twitter, Facebook, the CDC are providing the vaccination data, and we've got some survey data, and we're using MIT data for the electoral outcomes. So on to the main results. We have some nice correlations here. So, I mean, the first thing we spotted was that Republican voters tended to be much less likely to take up vaccines and much more hesitant as well. So you can see that's the top two slides. And so that was the strongest effect in our data set. But we then went on to look at vaccine hesitancy against daily vaccinations, in the bottom left, and that's also strongly correlated. So the vaccine hesitancy is obviously playing a strong role in whether somebody's vaccinated or not. And there's also, I think we might come back to this later, there's also a strong relationship between, a fairly strong relationship between online misinformation and Republican voting. So that's a bit more. We also looked at that at county level. So there's a strong relationship between Republican voting and vaccine hesitancy at the county level. So that's a bit of background, but now we're looking at relationships between vaccinations at the state level and online misinformation. So this is not quite a strong relationship, but the gray line here is corrected for other variables as well. So we corrected for all the different other variables, Republican voting, African-American populations, and all the other things. And we're still getting a signal that we're finding that the quantities of misinformation in each state is associated with the vaccination rates. And that is also, we find, a factor against the vaccination hesitancy survey data that we have. So we have this link here between online misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. And we did this plot of the states, and you can see that the brightly colored states in the Bible Belt have a larger than normal because of high levels of misinformation, and they're brightly colored because they're more vaccine hesitancy. So it just gives you a picture of the US. So those are at the state level. We also looked at the county level for these correlations between misinformation and vaccine hesitancy, and there is this relationship. What we've done here, we've separated out counties that voted Republican or Democrat in the last election, and you can see that there's this increase of Democrat voters according to the level of online misinformation we found on Twitter in those counties. There is, these again are controlled for all the different other variables we looked at. Without wanting to go into too much detail about Granger causality analysis, it's quite an involved subject. But what we can do is we can look at the level of misinformation on a particular day and look at whether there is increased vaccine hesitancy in the surveys a few days later. So if there's a large amount of misinformation, does that lead to an increase in hesitancy? And we pick many different days but it does look like if there's like a large quantity of misinformation, then 2 days later there seems to be small but statistically significant increase in vaccine hesitancy according to the surveys. So while we do have these sort of this link, I don't think we're going to go as far as claiming this is causation here. I think the main take-home message from this is more along the lines of we've got these geographical regions that have high levels of misinformation, and they also tend to have high levels of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine uptake. So, I mean, there are a lot of other biases in our data due to the fact that we're taking stuff from Twitter here, and Twitter is very biased in particular ways tend to be kind of more democratic users. We have quite a rough and ready. We're using the Carmen library for geolocation, so it's not perfect and there's a lot of noise, but the statistical models do take account of a lot of the noise. So apart from that, we have aggregated measurements. So this is not, we're not able to look at this from an individual level. We're looking at groups of populations, at regions, and we're open to the ecological fallacy here. What we have done is done a lot of sensitivity analysis to try and take account of group level effects and heteroscedasticity and other things like that. So hopefully we don't have any major problems with that. So yes, the takeaway message here, we've got evidence of localized clusters of vaccine hesitancy, which might be driven by misinformation. This indicates there could be a geographical component to the spread of misinformation about vaccines. So if somebody spreads some misinformation in a particular county, people around that area tend to pick it up more. And it suggests that actually misinformation is playing a role in vaccine hesitancy and is something that needs to be countered as part of a national strategy. So just a little bit of time to thank the people I've been working with on this. The major funders are the Knight Foundation, and also I think we have some money from the Craig Newmark Foundation as well. Thank you to Francesco, who did a large amount of work, and Matt, who also did a large amount of work on this, setting up the data and setting up the COVAXI tool. And then a lot of other people pitched in. It was quite a fast project given the limited amount of time and scope to get this up and running. So yeah, thank you to everyone. That's my talk.
Thank you very much, John. Our next speaker is Fernando Bemijo.
Hello. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see that. And all right. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with you today. I believe this is the last presentation of the seminar. So I'm sure it's been a long but fruitful day, and I'm here to put on the table a few reflections with a PowerPoint slides, set of PowerPoint slides with no color, no graphs, no videos. So bear with me. My talk is about the challenges in health misinformation research. I do research on health misinformation, but I mostly work with other people who do research on health misinformation, and talk to a lot of people trying to learn about the field and about this area of research. So what I'm trying to do today is just basically put on the table a few general ideas, a few reflections, kind of mapping what is it that we're doing here with research and misinformation in health. To start with, I think there is an issue with terminology and scope. So over the past few years, we've had a lot of words that have appeared and proliferated to talk about misinformation. We've heard fake news. We have which became very early politicized. We have propaganda, which is a long tradition. We have media manipulation, we have viral deception, misinformation, disinformation, and the latest edition, ampliganda, which I just found out about it in the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago. So part of the issue here is that it seems that there's a lot of terms that seem to refer to the same things, but it's not quite clear what is it that we're talking about, right? And I fear that there is, in addition, something which I would call the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is this idea that that because we name something, we know what we're talking about, and it has some kind of reality. And it is often the case that we don't have clear contours of what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about misinformation or disinformation or propaganda. And that, I think, creates a lot of confusion. There's also a lot of research in this space that talks mostly about identification of whatever phenomena we're working with, identification of fake news, identification of misinformation or disinformation, and also about mitigation. How do we fight this? But I think we're still far from understanding the impact. And I think, for instance, John's presentation we just witnessed, it talks a lot. It starts to take us in that direction, the direction of how do we assess the impact of what we're doing. In order to understand this a little bit better, I think it's important to have some kind of model, a general map of what is it that we're talking about. I like this particular model proposed by Camille Francois a couple of years ago, which is about disinformation, but I think it can apply generally to many other concepts that I described before. Sorry. So Camille Francois talked about the ABCs of disinformation and says we can talk about actors, behaviors, and content as vectors to understand the phenomena. And she talks about manipulative actors, deceptive behavior, and harmful content. It is interesting because this model it's appealing and can be applied to many other areas because it basically follows a very basic language structure, I think. Actors are subjects, behaviors are verbs, and content are objects, and therefore we end up having this model that actually looks like a very basic structure of language. And I think it's also appealing because it uses the alphabet, and the same way that when we tell someone the numbers 2, 4, and 8, then immediately people start thinking about 16. The moment that you say someone A, B, C, people try to add D, and then this becomes like a game of complementing and adding to this model. So if we look at actors, one of the things that happen with misinformation these days is that anybody can be an actor, anybody can be a producer or distributor of misinformation. So what are the attributes, the dimensions that we want to be looking at when we are talking about actors? We often need to detect intentionality, and this is hard. I put a difference there between a twitch and a wink, and by I'm not referring to twitch and winks as streaming platforms, but this anthropological distinction between things that are intentional and things that are not intentional, and therefore that are full with cultural meaning. This is from Clifford Geertz, who says that the moment that we think something is a wink, then that has layers of meaning and cultural meaning to it. So one of the first things that when we're researching actors in this space, one of the first things that we need to consider is whether there's intentionality or not, which is not always easy. We also need to look at motive, especially if we're thinking of mitigation. There's many different motives. What will people will produce or share mis or disinformation? It could be that they're just doing it for money, or they're doing it for the love, or for power and influence. And this is important to understand. There's also different layers of organization. So there's ad hoc organizations that happen just to do something in a particular moment or a particular time. And then there are well-established and resource organizations in the field of mis and disinformation. The famous Russian IRA, for instance. So we end up having many different types of actors in this field, which are not always easy to identify. You could have unaware collaborators, people who just share mis or disinformation without knowing that they're doing so. You have profit seekers and professionals, people who want to make money out of this, or that simply, and this is something that I find really interesting, that simply are not trying to sell you something, but it's a way of living. They just get a salary for being in this space and be professionals of mis and disinformation. And then you can have geopolitical operatives, of people who actually work for organizations who are interested in producing and distributing mis and disinformation. So that's a first vector, a first component that allow us to understand this space that we can name in different ways, but that has always actors who are participating in the creation and distribution of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, et cetera, et cetera. A second layer or a second vector is a vector of behavior. And when we study the vector of behavior, there is always this almost background model, which is the one that says that is an ideal that the internet is basically a place where honest individual voices meet in a free marketplace of ideas. And a lot of the behavior that is studied when we do research in this space has to do with things that somehow go against that model. In particular, coordination and deception. So coordination is one of the key elements in a lot of the research in this space, and has to do with the idea that people are not behaving in this marketplace of ideas as individuals, but they're coordinating to gain more strength and to spread some message. The other one is deception, and this idea that people are not being honest, and therefore they're not representing themselves as they are. And both of these things have different layers of automation to them. So there are ways in which coordination and deception can make use of certain automatic technical tools. And so these are things that are also part of the space of the research in mis and disinformation. The concerns around this is that oftentimes it's difficult. Coordination per se is not necessarily bad, because coordination is essential for online activism. And deception actually can be critical for vulnerable voices. So there's a lot of people who need to deceive and hide when actually they communicate online. So while it is important to understand coordination and deception as elements of behavior that usually accompany phenomena like misinformation, it's not necessarily the case that those things are pointing to something bad, and we have to be very aware of that. The third vector of this model is the one on content, and it's very important because when we're talking about misinformation, we're talking about some kind of content. We're not we call it misinformation, we don't call it misinforming or misinformant. So misinformation is the content that we consider to be not true. However, there's a lot of content that actually has no truth value, and it's problematic. So there might be opinions, humor, hate speech, which do not necessarily have a relationship with truth. And therefore, it is hard to study the same way that we study misinformation, because you cannot talk about correspondence with something that is true. When we talk about misinformation, we need to think about ground truth. And it is hard these days to actually find ground truth. I think we're suffering an attack on our epistemic constitution, Rausch calls it, in which it is hard to find sources of truth that everybody accepts and relies on. In addition to that, there's a problem with finding and identifying misinformation, which is that we often end up finding what we're looking for. So when we're dealing with large corpuses of data, the way we can find things is by doing, for instance, keyword searches. And we end up very often finding the things that we know exist, but it is hard to find things that we don't know that exist. And that's a challenge that I think a lot of this field is facing. Finally, there are a series of layers there, which are also important to consider, is that content travels across formats. So the text, images, audio, video, and a mix of them all. And it is much easier to do research with text than it is to do it with images or audio or video. And so I think there's a large path to be walked in terms of including other formats beyond text in the research that we're doing. There's an issue of platforms, which is that the information travels across many different platforms. It's not just only on one specific one like Twitter or Facebook or Reddit or whatever. It goes from platform to platform, including into messaging apps, which are by definition, in most cases, private and closed, and therefore it is hard to trace where misinformation goes when it enters those spaces. And finally, misinformation travels around the world, and it happens in different languages and different cultural contexts. And this is something that in the work that I do, it's very clear how it is very, very hard to understand what is happening in other places around the world because of language limitation, because of cultural context that we lack when we're doing research in this space. So that's a challenge to be able to understand what's happening in this space around the world. Finally, as I said, one of the beauties of this model is that you can actually keep on adding elements to it. So you have the D, and you can say, well, we need to consider when we're talking about actors, behavior, and content, that all that happens within platforms that distribute that content, and they have specific designs that may favor particular behaviors or particular types of content. And we cannot understand the world of mis and disinformation unless we take into consideration that it's not just an issue of certain actors behaving towards some type of content, but that content is actually traveling within platforms that have specific design features that make that content travel in specific ways. We cannot also ignore the issue of people and people who are decoding this psychological element of mis and disinformation. Is very, very powerful, and it needs to be considered if we want to have a full picture of the phenomenon. Finally, we also have with the D data, which is obviously what we need to be able to do research, and this is key. Now we can keep on adding letters. We can add an E. E for ecosystem, and this is something that is very dear to me, which is the idea that we cannot understand communication unless we understand that there are lots of different pieces that interact with each other, that communication is an ecosystem, and therefore we need to think of this field of study as an ecosystem with interacting parts. And also that ecosystem lives within an environment. And the fact that the media ecosystem might share similar characteristics, but happen in a different environment might end up producing different results. These are all words, and I was trying actually when I was preparing this presentation to come up with some kind of graphical representation of what I was going to say. And I came up with this idea that actually misinformation has different vectors, actors, behaviors, and content, that we need to decide whether we're trying to detect, assess, or mitigate this information. That actually misinformation happens in platforms, that those platforms that misinformation end up reaching people who have ways of understanding and dealing with the content, that happens within an environment in which there are many different platforms, many different actors, many different behaviors which interact with each other, and everything happens in a particular context, in a particular wider environment. And all of that you need data for if you want to understand it. So this is the map that I've created to help us think through some of the challenges that we face when we're studying mis and disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. So we're going to go now to questions. All the panelists can please join me. So our first question, which I think is very relevant for both John's and Fernando's presentation, is how do you define misinformation?
So yeah, I think what we're mainly using is the standard tool used by many researchers in the computational social science field, which the idea is that the web pages, the sources that promote misinformation are usually the same web pages. So there are a couple of organizations that are independent who are reviewing websites and assigning them scores according to how likely how low credibility those websites are. And the one we used in the study I presented was called Media Bias Fact Check, who've studied websites. We're also working now with NewsGuard data as well. So that's how we do it. We've got an independent organization who review web pages on our behalf.
Yeah, that's it is interesting because as I was trying to explain, there's a need for ground truth, and it's not always easy to find that ground truth. We need to rely on something to say this is misinformation. And one of the strategies, as John was describing, is you identify which sources are problematic, which actors who produce content have already been classified as prone to mis and disinformation. And that's a criteria that you can follow. Another very common one these days is you rely on fact checkers, and then you take what they've checked as something that is the word on what's true and what's not true. But as I said, one of the issues that we're facing these days is that it's becoming increasingly complicated to find ground truth that is widely accepted as something that we can work with and do research with.
Thank you. Angela, I'm going to ask this question to you. The others can also add to this. Do you think that platforms are doing enough to control misinformation? And are there any solutions that you would recommend?
I think that's a great question, also like $1 million question. I think when we think about whether platforms are doing enough, it's kind of helpful to think about our relations to the platforms, in a sense that, like, really in terms of what we can do, like exactly what we can do can actually change this. So I guess the short answer is, of course, they're not doing enough. But the longer answer is exactly what to do. And I think what's interesting since the election was that, like Twitter and like YouTube, a lot of these giant platforms really started to ban certain kind of misinformation. And I think in the short term, we might think this is a good move that really like terminate lots of unnecessary turmoil because of the spread of such content. But in the long run, what's positive is probably historically it was the first time that the amount of platform intervention in the public sphere and in what we see and know becomes foregrounded for the public to see and engage in a larger debate of what we can do with regard to regulating platforms. I think the recent outbreak from the Facebook papers also became like a further step in that direction. So I think what's needed is to like coordinate and make alliances with what kind of social actors to really showcase exactly what role platform is playing in terms of circulating and like changing exposure of certain message for certain demographic groups on their platform, to really like showcase that, so that the public has the power to influence regulatory bodies that can further impose regulations on platforms. And then we can talk about exactly what they can do technically to change the situation. May not answer your question, but that's my thought with regard to this. Thank you so much, Elaine.
Thank you, Angela. John, Fernando, do you have anything to add?
Well, yes, I think one thing we're looking at the work we found is that one of the problems is that many of the users on the platforms that spread a lot of misinformation are quite famous. I mean, a particular name comes to mind, but that person was banned. But there are still a lot of other people who are quite famous on these platforms and have a lot of influence, perhaps not on popular news channels and things like that. And these people, we're calling them super spreaders. They're doing a lot of spreading of misinformation. And I think platforms are quite reluctant. I think Twitter a little bit reluctant to actually take these accounts offline, because every time you do something like that, there's a big backlash. So I think it's quite difficult to moderate this, and it's maybe something that needs to start happening on the individual level, on the society level. And it's not just a platform problem, but I do applaud the fact that YouTube have recently taken down quite a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain balance there. So on the one hand, there is almost a contradiction between the goals of some of these platforms and the goals of a democratic functional society, right? Sometimes those things do not align. However, at the same time, I have the feeling that some of the platforms are very clearly feeling a threat that if the environment becomes too toxic, it's actually a threat to their own survival as they are. And so it's almost like a balancing game in which they're going to try to get away with a lot of things that do not align with democratic civic values, as long as that's not a threat to them as companies and business models. But if they become a threat, then they will do more to counter those things. So I think it's a very complicated game that is happening at this point.
That's very interesting. To go back to your presentation, John, did you find that there's certain groups that are most targeted by misinformation campaigns? And is it easy for you to study particular demographics on the platforms that you're using?
So I'm not sure we can talk about which groups are targeted, but we were able to sort of do a correlation analysis between counties that have particular political leanings and the levels of misinformation in those counties. And we did find a significant relationship between the more Republican counties who voted for Trump in the last election and the levels of misinformation in those counties. So that demographic, yes, but it's something we probably could explore a little bit more in our data. I think it's a good question.
Thank you. Angela, to add to that, you talked a little bit about this challenge of identifying specific groups to enable us to study inequity across different groups. Can you talk a bit more about that in the context of misinformation?
Thank you so much, Eileen. Yeah, I think it's very important for us to remember that when this larger problem we face, there is a we, but also this we is not really a unified entity. Because if platform is the environment where a lot of this has been happening, and we all know that the kind of algorithm, the kind of curation that platforms has been refining over the years is about personalization and like individual predictive analytics, in a sense that their entire business is about like singling out each individual and feed them the things that would keep them most on the platform. And there are all kinds of studies that find is like vulnerable groups, especially communities of color and communities of diasporas, are particularly targeted. And there are research on how economically predatory ads are just like differentially being fed to vulnerable groups and politically as well. So I think it will be really important for us to really get into such communities and to understand the environment from their perspective as well. And this goes back to Fernando's presentation, which I really like. I think I used to be at a conference where people talk about developing this really sophisticated computing apparatus to identify bad actors on the internet. But then at that moment, there were scholars researching online activism. They would ask, they immediately feel like that language just sounds familiar, right? So I think it's also important to get into the community and try to develop computing tools with input from those communities as a way to really mitigate what they have experiencing, which could be very, very different from what the general we would perceive of this larger problem. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question that just came in. It says, your ground truth directly implicates what you consider to be misinformation. So John and Fernando, can you talk a bit more about this? John, specifically in your analysis, how do you think that your definition of truth impacted the findings?
It's a difficult question. I think the standard we stand behind is the idea that we're using independent fact checkers who rate the sources of information as being low credibility websites and spreaders of misinformation. So for example, a website such as Fox News is not considered to be low credibility. There's quite a high bar for this low credibility information rating. So yes, it's hard because maybe there is some bias in these organizations, but we have to stand behind the results we have and argue that they're based on that, I think you have to either accept that or not.
Thanks, John. Fernando?
Yeah, no, I agree with John. It's a difficult issue. It's hard, and as I said, there's a lot of problematic, harmful content that doesn't even have a truth value. So we're just almost dealing with a section that should be more tractable, because at least we can say, oh, this is the truth. Is this reflecting the truth or not? But even that, it's complicated. It's not so simple anymore. But it happens with all the dimensions of these problems. And one of the things that is very common, I feel, in this field of research is this whole idea of there is so much disinformation about vaccines and microchips, for instance. Why? Because we go out and we search content out there in social media, in the news, that talk about vaccines and microchips, but actually nobody's reading whether the references to vaccines and microchips are saying, oh, be careful, don't get vaccinated, you're going to get a microchip, or is someone who is talking about how crazy that idea is, or someone who is discussing how prevalent that has become in social media. So we end up identifying the topic, which is vaccines and microchips, but we don't know whether the references to the topic are actually challenging, supporting, criticizing, analyzing, and that's a very complicated problem.
Yeah, thank you. To follow up on that mention of disinformation, so one thing that we've seen during this pandemic is that there's been a lot of government promoted disinformation. So what concerns you most about this trend, and what can the public do about it? Any one of you can start.
I just had a long conversation today with my friend Ethan Zuckerman, and we were talking about similar issues. And one of the things that he said was, we need to start thinking about mis and disinformation not as a technological or research problem, but as a cultural, political problem. It goes beyond how can we fix this platform, or how can we find this content, or it's wider than that, because it's kind of penetrated the fabric of society and of democracy and of politics. And I think that's the hard part there, right? It's not, you cannot do surgery anymore there, because it's not a particular area that is problematic. It's become so spread, and it touches such critical elements of society that it's hard to find like a single magical solution that say, well, if we do this, the problem will be solved.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Fernando says. I think it reflects a general decline in trust in government agencies, in mainstream journalism, also in scientific institutions. And I think this trend is also quite specific to the US when we think about this highly polarized political landscape, and also the way the US very private media system works to really fill some of these trends. And going back to this larger view of misinformation, what I also want to add is that if we think about trust in the government as this major variable that explains a lot of what's happening here, we can also understand why in some of the other political systems where people would deliberately seek out censored information when the government says it's rumors, because there is no trust in what the government says. So when we think about that, these might be seemingly very different political regimes, but based on what happened in recent years, we basically see a spectrum where there's not really a categorical difference in terms of how the public approaches information based on how state and society is related. So that's also something that really alarms me, thinking about the two societies I study as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think you're right. There is quite a broad range of different issues at play here. I think one of the things we probably feel is a major problem, though, is the fact that there's this popularity bias for information. So when something starts to get popular, it gets more popular and more popular, and so you get these big spikes of highly seen posts, and you can play against that with when you're making sensational posts. And I think foreign governments have been using that to create these campaigns where things tend to spread widely, quite sensational in quite sensational ways. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing we found in the research we've been doing is looking at how foreign governments are able to manipulate social media, is that they tend to use quite a lot of coordination. So you would have many different accounts all retweeting one particular account, or you'd have many different accounts posting the same sorts of misinformation. So there are tools that we're developing. We've got a tool called BotSlayer, which is supposed to be detecting those kinds of coordinated campaigns. And it's something we're going to be working on quite a bit in the future.
Thank you. I'm definitely looking for solutions, so I keep coming back to whether there's anything you can think about. So I'm thinking about the populations and the individual's responsibility. Are there ways in which we could educate people to be more aware of misinformation and disinformation so they can respond to it themselves?
I think it's something that has to happen in schools. I think there are more and more tools being developed in Indiana University Observatory. To go back to ourselves, we have one called Fakie, which you can find on our website. And the idea is it's basically just teaching people how to recognize what is information, what is good and what is poor information, and teaching them to spot the misinformation and to not pass it on. So there's a kind of media literacy tools and social media tools, and it's something that can happen at a kind of educational level.
Thanks, Jen. Anything from Angela?
Yeah, what I want to add is that I think one kinds of population that's under researched or under attended in this larger problem are communities of immigrants and diasporas, and especially like we see all kinds of messaging apps that are pretty much closed for research but are so much alive, that really connects these communities. And sometimes it's not really a linguistic barrier kind of issue. So like, it's just they are like a lot more connected to lots of the domestic publics in the other countries. And then there are like pockets of like circulation of misinformation, disinformation, that really form its own ecology. And I think also we need to attend to translations of all kinds of disinformation across linguistic spheres. I have a student who studies Japanese far-right Twitter universe, and there's like all kinds of prominent translations of COVID-related information from English that are further spread back to Japan as well. I think this kind of dynamics and also the individuals and communities involved in this, and they need to be attended to as well.
And I think, I think media literacy is obviously important. But one of the things that it's interesting to consider is how we've become. So information, reliable information has come to us forever in a particular format and for particular types of sources. And then all of a sudden, that format that seems the reliable way of presenting information can actually be used by all kinds of actors. And so it's not just the content of what you're seeing, but the presentation of the content that actually has a very powerful effect on audiences. And so you end up watching things that look like a traditional, reliable news broadcast. And the immediate tendency is like, okay, this is probably reliable, I should believe it. But then it could be just produced anywhere by anyone. And it's become very easy to have the means to produce professional, reliable looking news without the infrastructure and the routines and the professionalism that used to accompany that kind of information. And that creates a dissonance that it also makes it very easy to fall for falsehood.
Thank you. Do you think that there's been significant progress in the control of misinformation during this pandemic? Because we've seen a lot of collaborations between organizations like the WHO and YouTube, or WHO and WhatsApp, and their aim has been to spread truth, hoping that that would help curb the spread of misinformation. In your work, do you think that there's been significant change during this pandemic?
So we're starting to see a bit more about how the damage misinformation can do. I think this has really come into focus in the last year, both from COVID misinformation. I mean, people ivermectin, for example, but also the Capitol Hill riots as well. And the information about stealing the misinformation about stealing the election. These were two really stark examples of how much damage misinformation can do. So, yeah, we're beginning to find ways to respond to that. And as I was saying earlier, I applaud YouTube's response. But there are still a lot of other platforms. I mean, now we've got TikTok. And a lot of the people who aren't vaccinated at the moment are the kind of young people who use TikTok and Instagram. And as researchers, we don't have access to those data, and there are no controls to make sure we have access to those data. So I think there's still a long way to go and a lot more to do here. So I would urge for more transparency of data and more access to data from platforms.
Yeah, I really agree with what John says. And I think because of all these difficulties that the digital environment really presents us, maybe it's also productive if we approach this again from a more holistic perspective, to think about media ecology that's beyond the internet, beyond social media, and also to really take into account that individuals, they are human beings, and they, when they interpret a message, they like make use of their own identity, their like community experience, and their memories as well. So I think one thing I noticed is that this kind of circulation of misinformation on the platforms tends to assume that people who share are the ones that believe the information, or like people who get exposed to the misinformation are the ones that kind of like falls prey to the content. But that's like in reality usually not what really happens. Sharing might be a social gesture that's fundamentally communal, and also when people see it, it could like rather be exposure nudged by platform mechanisms, and the person itself, the way how you interpret that really depends on like your life experience, right? So there could be intervention that steps beyond like digital dissemination of information by more trusted organizations, but maybe just some kind of community outreach that's beyond that approach. That's my thought.
Yeah, but in terms of the platforms work to fight the problem, I think that the platforms have learned quite a bit over the past 4 or 5 years The problem is that what they were facing 4 or 5 years ago was very minor compared to what they're facing today. So I think they stepped up the game in terms of putting together tools and resources to fight certain problems, but the problem has become actually much larger than it was. And so when before COVID arrived, anti-vax was obviously present, but it was a pocket of the internet, so to speak. Now, all of a sudden, because of COVID, then vaccination has become an everyday issue, and therefore the wave of mis and disinformation is so much larger than what they could have faced a few years back. That even though they improve their game, they're still behind in many ways.
Thank you. I think my last question is twofold. First, I'm curious about what you're currently working on this topic, and also what do you wish for? What changes would you like to see in terms of how misinformation is being controlled? Angela, we can start with you.
Thank you, Aileen. I think broadly, what I'm interested right now, part of what I'm interested right now is how counterpart organizations that hopes to detect misinformation, and I'm using scare quotes here, in China are applying similar methods that are developed by global communities of computing experts, but they are just targeting the kind of information. Again, when we goes back to the ground truth problem, that is very hard to really determine whether they're misinformation or not. But the question is, because they're embedded in a different power structure, they're able to use the exact same kind of computing methodology to achieve a goal that I think lots of people who are really engaged in this type of research would not really see. So part of the related to this question is also, how are we able to build up and develop a computing infrastructure that could preemptively prevent such attempts of appropriating it for ends that are not democratic and not liberating. So that's one of the main questions I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Angela. John?
So we're looking at a number of things, actually. We're doing some looking at anti-vaccine tweets, and we're trying to build a classifier to tell the difference between pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine tweets. I think it was neutral and anti-vaccine. We're also looking at how confident messages about vaccines spread online, and we're trying to see if we can do an experiment where we're creating an intervention which is spreading confident messages on vaccines within Black American communities. And then hopefully we'll see if that actually makes an actual difference, and we'll get some kind of impact. And then finally, we're looking at models of how, more nuanced models of how vaccine misinformation actually affects the changes in vaccine uptake rates, and then that leads on to actual impact on the ground of people getting infections, and coming up with the number of this information caused this many people to catch COVID and this many people to die, these kinds of models. So those are a few of the bits and pieces we're looking at.
Very interesting. Thank you. Fernando.
Yeah, so I'm working on a few different things. We have a project in the Media Ecosystems Analysis Group, which is basically working with different researchers on developing methodologies to research mis and disinformation around global health, and to use data from places other than the West. So that's kind of a goal that the project has, and we're working with people at Boston University and Harvard and people in Italy, and it's an interesting project that is producing very cool results. We're also doing research with Media Cloud on health influencers in Africa. So basically trying to understand who are the key voices that are talking about health in different African countries, and then trying to figure out what their presence in social media looks like. And finally, we're also working on a podcast series about health myths and disinformation, which hopefully will be released the next month or so. So those are all the different projects that I'm working on right now.
Thank you. I'm very interested in your project in Africa. I would definitely love to learn more about that. So thank you again, Angela, John, and Fernando, for your participation today. I'll also like to thank the audience for their questions, and I want to remind everyone that the video from today's session will be posted to the Hariri Institute YouTube channel. I'd like to welcome back Yanis and Gianluca for the symposium closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you for moderating this session. So we are getting towards the end of the symposium, and what we have planned for now is perhaps some slides with reflections from the sessions that we organized and today. So as I'm sharing my screen, and before I do that, I would like first to thank a few people. I'm not going to thank the entire team. Many people have contributed to the success of this workshop, but I would like to mention specifically Catherine D'Angelo and Gina Mantica. Catherine is the responsible person for programs and events at the Hariri Institute, and Gina is the communications and media specialist at Hariri. They have done a lot of work, tremendous amount of work behind the scenes that you haven't seen, and without them, this symposium would not have been possible. So let me share my screen. And I'll start with some reflections from the earlier sessions today. So I think we heard that AI models are here, are accurate, explainable in many instances, and their use in healthcare is expanding. I heard a little bit of hesitation from our actually four MDs in the second session on whether they are in use in healthcare. But I think what I will take is David Bates' optimism that we are using them and we want to use more of them and do so faster. One, I think, takeaway is that AI models offer the opportunity to improve the quality of healthcare that is being delivered, and also potentially to democratize the use of healthcare, particularly in settings that are in rural areas, in non-urban areas, that these are populations that don't necessarily have access, at least in where they live, to excellent quality healthcare. And through the use of these models, they can get access to excellent healthcare. I think, though, that we need to be cautious, as several of our panelists today indicated, on how these models are being used, and also to be cautious as we look ahead to develop new models for more conditions, for more sort of events of interest that we are interested in predicting. So we heard from Emma Pearson that we need to use labels that are primary sources of what we want to predict, rather than using biased proxies. For instance, physician actions could be biased for a number of reasons. Also, that we need to develop models that are interpretable whenever that is possible, and it is possible with mostly tabular data. with images, with voice, even with text. Deep learning models are likely the way to go. And also, as we develop models, to check and modify and iterate on these models. So use experts, use human reasoning to understand what the model is doing and potentially edit, correct the model through the methods that Rick Caruana, for instance, suggested today, or even through more careful selection of variables and the labels in order to end up with a model that is interpretable and makes sense in a healthcare setting. We also heard from Jenna Wins that we need to develop models that are robust to guard against the distributional shifts in the data that are quite common in the healthcare setting, and also potentially to adversarial attacks. As these models become more and more prevalent, we may see these types of attacks that we have seen in other domains of use of AI models. And finally, I think one comment that sort of came through a number of different panels and was mentioned by many different people is that we need to be training and testing these models using diverse data, because data that are from one particular locale, they may have biases, and we need to, the extent possible, at least be testing the models that we develop using more diverse data from many different locations to ensure that the models that are being trained do not incorporate any sort of bias. So with that, I would like to pass the baton to Rebecca, and I'll be sharing the slides maybe to make it easier, Rebecca, that she will summarize some of the points that were made in the panel that she moderated.
Thanks, Yannis. So we had a wonderful panel with Irene Denkwa-Mullen, Leo Selly, and David Bates talking about how learning health systems are actually employing or deploying AI. I think we heard loud and clear that health equity is really rooted in society's values and structural inequities that have kind of pre-existed AI for decades, if not longer, but that really have resulted in what we see today in healthcare outcome inequities, but that those inequities introduce bias into the very data that we're seeking to train our models on. They introduce bias into the scientific literature that we use as evidence-based medicine, and they certainly introduce bias into the lived experience, both of our patients as well as our providers, and how they approach relating and having empathy with their patients. The other thing we heard is that all of that bias exists across the continuum of AI, scientific and technical development. And we really need to focus in on addressing that bias across that continuum, or we will have failed in the end. And the goal really being equitable health outcomes. There's kind of no other gold standard that we're seeking other than to make sure that we break down the structural inequities that have resulted in current health outcome inequities and don't perpetuate them in new technologies. And so I think kind of 3 points in how we can address that. One is making sure we have inclusive science. So that's not just the diversity of data that Yannis was just talking about, but also making sure that we are funding diverse teams and encouraging maybe new or innovative research partnerships, building capacity across diverse demographics, both in research and implementation, is very important. And that we really can drive AI into healthcare. I think, we heard in the panel that Yannis moderated that AI is here. I think, yes, there was some trepidation in the panel that I was moderating around how far we should let AI get in its current iteration, given the biases that do exist, but that there are safe places to start with AI in healthcare, namely things like operational efficiencies, and that algorithms will continue to evolve the same way that the AI is a learning algorithm. So is our understanding of how to deploy it and employ it in healthcare. It was not lost on me, actually, that The energy-based model that Rich Karuna talked about in the prior session as the glass box model is what we should be striving for. And that same acronym of EBM, evidence-based medicine in this case, right, is what we strive for in medicine. And so I think if we can take EBM of AI and EBM of medicine and strive towards that goal, we will all be better off for it. One thing that Dr. Denkwa-Mullen mentioned, of course, is that there are ethical considerations of AI beyond just bias, and that we cannot ignore those. She had an entire slide kind of filled to the gills of other ways that there are ethical considerations in AI. And so although we are obviously quite focused on bias, and this symposium was focused on that, we really need to look at AI more holistically. Turn it back to you, Yannis.
All right, then I'll summarize the last session, which maybe it's still fresh in your mind since it was 5 minutes ago or whatever, 10 minutes ago. So I highlighted a few challenges that emerged throughout all the presentations and the answers during the session. The first one is that when we study misinformation, we need to think about what we're even measuring. So we need to agree on a definition or how to find misinformation that we can base our studies on. And there are many related definitions, and they kind of overlap, but not really. There are differences. We need to think about the motive of people sharing misinformation. So there may be malicious actors, but there are also people who legitimately believe in what they're sharing, right? And so we need to think about the implications of this. And in general, how do we establish ground truth? So if we search for known misinformation, let's say COVID plus 5G, we find many posts on social media about COVID and 5G, but what else are we missing? Maybe we don't know about certain narratives that actually may be more important. We may base our analysis on fact-checking or low credibility sources. Is that enough? And what about biases? So what if our ground truth is actually biased? Are we actually making the wrong conclusions? So this is something that emerged throughout the discussion. And then misinformation is not only text. We also have videos, images, and so on. How do we take care of that? There are many challenges there. And then once we come up with our definition and we find ground truth, we actually need data to actually measure what's going on. And this data often comes from platforms, social media, and so on. There are many biases there as well. So there may be systemic inequalities. Certain demographics may be overrepresented because they use social media more or certain platforms more. We may want to find geolocation information to sort of map it with what's happening on the ground, what John was presenting about, but that information may not be completely accurate. There may be cultural specific characteristics of certain platforms that may not generalize to the rest of the world. Angela made the example of Chinese platforms that may not generalize to the Western hemisphere. The same goes for other countries and cultures and so on. And in general, whatever we measure goes through the lens of platform interference to some extent. So we have recommendation algorithms, we have potentially censorship, we have moderation. So what we are seeing is not necessarily what people are seeing or were seeing when the data was actually, when the content was actually posted, and we need to think about that. And going to mitigations, we need to think about and consider many different aspects. So there are platform aspects, societal aspects, political aspects. A solution that was floated around is educating people. Is this enough? How do we do it effectively, and so on? And that's something we need to think about going forward. Next slide. All right, and with this, we are done. I would like to thank everybody, the audience, for sticking with us until the very end, the FRP community, all the faculty, Yannis, Rebecca, all the panelists and moderators as well, Eric Kolasik and Elaine and Sozi as well. The Hariri Institute for Computing in general, Catherine and Gina in particular. Yannis already thanked you, but really this wouldn't have been possible without you. Our co-sponsors, the School of Public Health at BU, the Division of Emerging Media Studies in the BU College of Communication, and the BU Center for Information and Systems Engineering. And then one last announcement, the next symposium by the Hariri Institute will be on the topic of simulation modeling for population health, and that will be on June 6 and June 7, 2022. So there's still some time, but put it in your calendars. And then finally, if you found this symposium interesting and would like to keep track of the activities by the Institute, feel free to follow the Hariri Institute on your favorite social media or platform, online platform in general. And with this, thanks, and we're all done.